In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Now, who would have thought that that simple line would have led to the publishing phenomenon that we have in the world today? Not only movies, but books, music, stage plays, video games, online games, card games, board games. It's just phenomenal. It was in the early 30s, Tolkien was marking school certificate papers, and he was marking one student's paper and he came to a blank page. And for some reason he wrote, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." Now, being Tolkien, he stared at it and he thought, I'll have to think out what a hobbit is and why does he live in a hole. And from that he started creating a story for his children, which would evolve into the first book, The Hobbit. Now, his secretary, Elan Griffiths, she had a, what would you call it, like an unfinished manuscript of the story, and she showed it to a lady, a friend of hers called Susan Dagnall, who worked for Allen and Unwin, the publishers. She presented the unfinished manuscript to Stanley Unwin, who was the chairman of the publishing company, and he asked, could Tolkien send a finished manuscript of this story? So Tolkien finished it off, and when Stanley Unwin received the manuscript, he gave it to his 10-year-old son, whose name was Rayner Unwin, and asked him what did he think of the story. Now, Rayner actually wrote down notes basically saying this was a great story for children, it should be published. A 10-year-old boy, mind you. And so The Hobbit was published, and it was published in September 1937, and immediately a 1500 print run immediately sold out. And 1500 doesn't sound much to us in these days, but in those days a run of 1500 was quite considerable because they were all hardback books. And what happened then was they immediately did a second print in the same year, later in the year. And the book won a children's book prize. But of course then the war intervened and there was a children's book club edition came out in 1942. Now, the publishers immediately asked Tolkien to write a new Hobbit story. This would evolve over the next 10 or so years into The Lord of the Rings. But The Lord of the Rings became more than a children's story. It became a very large, long story, and of course the audience was now for an adult audience. The Lord of the Rings was finally ready for publishing in 1949, but because of publication problems and problems with the publishers, the book finally was published in 1954 in 3 parts. Once again, the publisher decided to make it into 3 parts because of costs. And they even put up £1,000 against a loss. They didn't expect it to do real well. But of course, as we know, it did exceedingly well. The Hobbit it starts off very light and very childish, and it's like a grandfather talking to, he actually does it as a grandfather talking to children. But as the story evolves, it becomes darker and more, adult-like towards the end of it, with the Battle of the 5 Armies and the dragon and all those things. And of course, when he was asked to write a second Hobbit story, he started out once again in a very light manner. But after he'd written about half the book, he changed his mind and went back and started rewriting it. I think the major theme in Tolkien's writings is courage and friendship. There are a lot of other life lessons to be learned reading the books, but I honestly believe they're the 2 main ones, courage and friendship. And a lot of people believe that The Lord of the Rings is about the hobbits taking the ring to Mount Doom. But if you read the rest of Tolkien's Middle-earth stories, you soon become aware that the main issue in the story is the return of the king, Aragorn, because he is like the, what's that word? He's like the final chapter in a great series of stories that go back thousands of years. And finally, you know, the age of man has been born, and the elder days are over. The elves can now depart and go back to the west, where they came, where they always wanted to return. And the dominion of men has started. And all of his stories, the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, The Hobbit to some extent, and The Lord of the Rings, are all about the development of the domination of men. And it all comes to a final climax and a resolution with the crowning of Aragorn as the King of Gondor.